Captain Elindra Savith had mapped 300 dead systems in her lifetime, and she had never once been surprised by what she found, because the universe was old and mostly empty, and the things that floated through it were almost always rocks or dust, or the broken pieces of ships that had run out of fuel 1,000 years ago. She was 140 years old, which made her middle-aged by the standards of the Velhari, a species of tall bioluminescent beings whose skin glowed faintly blue in the dark, and who had been exploring the stars for longer than most civilizations had existed. Her ship was called the Wandering Petal, and it was a mid-range survey vessel, built for long patrols through the outer edges of the Orion Spur, where nothing interesting ever happened, and where the silence between the stars stretched on for weeks at a time. On this particular morning, if you could call it morning, in a place where the sun never rose, Elindra was sitting in her command chair reviewing the same blank scanner readouts she had been reviewing for 11 days straight, when her analyst, a young Velhari woman named Dian, suddenly sat up straight at her console and said, "Captain, I am picking up something strange." Elindra did not react immediately, because Dian was young and excitable, and she had said the same thing about a spinning asteroid 2 weeks ago. "What kind of strange?" Elindra asked, without looking up. "A signal," Dian said, and this time her voice was different, not excited but confused. "It is faint and repeating, and I cannot identify the encoding. It does not match anything in the Galactic Index." That made Elindra look up. The Galactic Index contained the communication signatures of over 4,000 known species, and if something was transmitting on a frequency that matched none of them, then it was either a malfunction or it was something that should not exist. Her first officer, Torek, was already on his feet, heavy reptilian frame, casting a long shadow across the bridge as he moved to look over Dian's shoulder, and his yellow eyes narrowed as he studied the data. "Where is it coming from?" he asked. "That is the other strange part," Dian said. "It is coming from a region that is marked as completely empty. No stars, no stations, no charted civilizations for 200 light-years in any direction." Torek turned to Elindra, and she could read the caution in his expression before he even opened his mouth, because Torek was Krethian, and the Krethians were a careful species who believed that unknown things in dark places were almost always dangerous. "Captain," he said slowly, "unidentified signals in dead space are not something we should investigate without support." "Noted," Elindra said, and then she told the helmsman to change course toward the signal. It took them 6 hours to reach the source, and when they did, Elindra stood at the viewport and stared at it in silence. For a long time, it was a capsule, just a small thing, barely 2 meters long, tumbling slowly end over end through the void, like a bottle thrown into an ocean that had no shore. And its hull was dark and smooth, and made of an alloy that the ship's sensors could not identify. "It does not match any known material," Dian reported from her station, and there was awe in her voice now. "Captain, this is not Velhari, or Krethian, or Drethari, or anything else I have ever seen." "How old is it?" Elindra asked. Dian ran the spectral dating sequence 3 times before she answered, because she clearly did not believe the result. 12,000 years, she said quietly. "It has been drifting for 12,000 years. The bridge went silent. 12,000 years ago, the Velhari had already been exploring space for centuries, and the Galactic Index had already catalogued thousands of species, and yet somehow, this small dark capsule, made of unknown metal, transmitting on an unknown frequency, had been floating through empty space all that time, without anyone ever finding it. "We should leave it," Torek said firmly. "It could be a weapon, or a biohazard, or a trap. We do not know what species made it, or why it is here." Elindra heard him, and she understood his concern, because he was right that the safe thing to do would be to mark the coordinates, and send the data back to the Survey Authority, and let someone else deal with it. But she had been mapping dead systems for decades, and she had never once found something that made her feel the way this small tumbling capsule made her feel. which was a sensation she could only describe as the universe holding its breath. "Bring it aboard," she said. The retrieval team used magnetic clamps to stop the capsule's rotation and guide it into the cargo bay. And when it was finally resting on the deck, under the bright white lights of the ship, Elindra walked a slow circle around it. Studied every centimeter of its surface. It was simple in design, almost brutally so, with none of the elegance that most spacefaring species built into their technology. No decorative patterns, no flowing lines, no evidence of aesthetic consideration at all. Just function and nothing else, as if whoever built it had been in a hurry and had cared about only one thing, which was making sure it worked. There were markings on the side, characters in a language that the translator could not read, and beneath the characters was a symbol that looked like a blue and green circle with white swirls across its surface. "Cut it open," Elindra said. The engineering team used plasma torches to slice through the outer hull, and even that was strange, because the metal resisted the cutting beam far longer than it should have for something so thin, as if it had been designed to survive anything the universe could throw at it. When the hull finally split open and the two halves fell away, the entire cargo bay fell silent. Inside the capsule, packed in a thick layer of crystallized gel that glowed faintly amber in the light, was a body. It was small and pale and soft-skinned, with dark hair pressed flat against its skull, and two closed eyes set in a face that looked almost peaceful, as if it were only sleeping. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, and no claws, and no armor, and no bioluminescence, and nothing at all that suggested it could survive in the cold vacuum of space. "What is it?" Torek whispered. Dean was already scanning, and her hands were shaking as she read the results. "It is organic," she said. "Definitely biological, carbon-based with a water-dependent cellular structure. But it does not match any species in the index, not even close. This is something completely new." Ildra leaned closer and looked at the still face of the creature in the amber gel, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something old and deep that she had not felt in a very long time. It looked fragile, it looked impossible, and it looked like it had been waiting a very long time to be found. She ran every scan the ship had on the body inside the amber gel, and each result made her more confused than the last, because this creature broke every rule she had ever learned about what a spacefaring species was supposed to look like. It had no natural radiation shielding, which meant its homeworld must have had a magnetic field strong enough to protect it from its own star. And it had no redundant organs, which meant that if even one of its major systems failed, it would simply die. Its bones were dense but brittle, and its skin was thin enough to cut with a fingernail, and its eyes were clearly designed for a narrow band of visible light, which meant it had evolved under a very specific kind of sun. "This species is catastrophically fragile," Dean announced to the bridge crew on the second day. "I cannot understand how it survived long enough to build a spacecraft. It has almost no natural defenses against anything." Torek snorted from his station. "Did not build the capsule. Perhaps it was cargo." "No," Deanne said, shaking her head. "The capsule was designed around this body specifically. The gel matrix, the internal dimensions, the restraint systems, all of it was built for a creature of exactly this size and shape. Whoever made the capsule made it to keep this one individual alive." "Alive?" Elindra repeated from her command chair, and she turned to look at Deanne sharply. "You said it was dead." "I said it appeared dead," Deanne corrected, and she pulled up a new scan on the main display. "But I have been monitoring the gel, and it is not inert, Captain. It is maintaining a chemical exchange with the body at an incredibly slow rate. There are metabolic signs so faint I almost missed them, a heartbeat occurring roughly once every 40 minutes, and cellular respiration at a level I have never seen before." "It is alive," Elindra said. "It is in some form of hibernation, so deep that it mimics death," Dien said. Is sustaining it, feeding it, keeping its cells from degrading. It has been doing this for 12,000 years. The bridge was silent, as everyone absorbed what that meant. Torek was the first to speak, and his voice was hard. Captain, we do not know what this creature is, or what it will do when it wakes up. We should keep it in stasis and deliver it to the Survey Authority. If the gel fails, it will die, Dien said quietly. The chemical reserves are almost depleted. Another few decades, and the metabolic exchange will stop. Ilindra looked at the image of the creature on the display screen, that small pale face with its closed eyes and its dark hair. And she made a decision that she knew Torek would hate. Thaw it, she said. Captain, Torek began. I am not going to let it die in a jar, Ilindra said firmly. Begin a controlled thaw. Dien, monitor every second of it. The process took 6 hours. They moved the capsule to the medical bay, and Dien carefully raised the temperature of the gel, 1 degree at a time, while monitoring the creature's vital signs on every instrument available. And the crew gathered outside the glass partition and watched in tense silence as 12,000 years of sleep slowly came to an end. The first sign was the heartbeat accelerating from once every 40 minutes to once every 30, and then 20, and then 10, and then suddenly it was beating at a rhythm that Dien measured at 72 beats per minute, which was so fast that she thought the creature was having a cardiac emergency, until she realized that this was apparently normal. Then the breathing started, shallow at first and then deeper, and the chest began to rise and fall in a steady rhythm. Then the fingers twitched. Then the eyes opened. They were brown and wide and full of terror, and the creature let out a sound that made every person on the ship flinch, because it was loud and raw and desperate in a way that none of them had ever heard a living thing sound before. She screamed. She thrashed and ripped herself free of the dissolving gel and fell off the table, and scrambled backward until her back hit the wall, and she pressed herself against it, shaking and wild-eyed and soaking wet and gasping for air. And she spoke rapidly in a language that sounded harsh and fast and afraid. The universal translator struggled with it, catching fragments and spitting out broken words that flickered across Dien's screen. Where, and ship, and how long, and please. Ilindra stepped into the medical bay slowly, with her hands open and her skin dimmed to its softest glow, because she understood fear when she saw it, and she knew that this creature, whatever it was, had just woken up in a place it did not recognize, surrounded by beings it had never seen before. You are safe, Ilindra said gently, even though she knew the translator might not convey it properly yet. Hurt you. The creature stared at her with those brown eyes, and Ilindra could see intelligence in them, sharp and bright and calculating, even through the fear. And she could see the moment when the creature decided to stop panicking and start thinking. The breathing slowed, and the shaking steadied, and the creature stood up on unsteady legs, and wiped the gel from her face, and said something that the translator finally rendered clearly. My name is Commander Mara Yuan, she said. Service number 7712, Earthship Meridian. Who are you, and where am I? Ilindra felt something electric run through her at the sound of those words, because they were not the words of a frightened animal. They were the words of a soldier giving her identification in hostile territory, and that told Ilindra more about this species than any scan ever could. I am Captain Ilindra Savath, of the Velhari survey vessel Wandering Petal, she replied. We found your capsule drifting in open space and brought you aboard. The Meridian, Mara said, and her voice cracked. My ship. There was an explosion. The reactor failed. I was in the emergency pod, and then... She stopped and looked around the medical bay at the alien technology and the alien faces and the stars outside the viewport. How long? Ilindra hesitated because she knew what she was about to say would be the cruelest thing she had ever told another living being. Your capsule has been drifting for approximately 12,000 years, she said. Mara did not scream, and she did not cry, and she did not collapse. She went still, completely and absolutely still, in a way that Elindra had never seen a living creature go still before, as if every system inside her had simply stopped, while her mind tried to process a number that no mind should ever have to process. 12,000 years. Her crew was gone, and her ship was gone, and everyone she had ever known or loved was gone. Entire civilization might be gone, and she was standing barefoot and soaking wet in a room full of aliens who glowed in the dark, and she was the only human being she knew of in the entire universe. Mara Ewan stood there in the silence for a long time. And then she took a breath, and lifted her chin, and said in a voice that was steady, even though her hands were not, "Then I need to know everything that has happened since I have been gone." Elindra looked at this small, fragile, impossible creature, who had just been told that her entire world had ended 12,000 years ago, and who had responded not by breaking, but by asking for a briefing, and she thought to herself that whatever species this was, she had never encountered anything like it before. And she was not sure the galaxy had either. In the days that followed, Mara healed faster than Diane thought was biologically possible. The thawing process had left her with muscle tears and minor internal bleeding and cracked skin across her hands and feet, and Diane had estimated a recovery time of at least 3 weeks based on what she knew about organic tissue repair. But Mara was walking without pain on the 2nd day, and by the 4th day the cracks on her skin had sealed themselves and the bruises had faded to nothing. "Her body is repairing itself at a rate I cannot explain," Diane told Elindra in a private meeting. "The cells divide and rebuild damaged tissue as if they have been doing it their entire evolutionary history, not just recovering from injury, but actively improving the repair site. Captain, her bones are denser at the fracture points than they were before the fracture." "She breaks and comes back stronger," Elindra said. "Yes," Diane said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite fear, but was certainly not comfort. "That is exactly what she does." As Mara recovered, she began to talk, and as she talked, the crew of the Wandering Petal began to understand what kind of world had made her. Earth was a Class 12 planet. When Diane heard this, she dropped her datapad because Class 12 was not a category that was supposed to produce intelligent life. It was a category that was supposed to produce nothing at all except rocks and suffering. The planetary classification system ran from 1 to 15, with 1 being a calm, stable paradise and 15 being a molten hellscape, and anything above Class 8 was considered fundamentally hostile to the development of complex organisms. "Your homeworld has a gravity index of what?" Torek asked during one of the evening briefings, and his voice was flat with disbelief. "About 9.8 meters per second squared," Mara said casually, as if she were describing the weather. Torek stared at her. "Because the Krethian homeworld had a gravity of 6.1, and the Krethians were considered one of the physically toughest species in the known galaxy. And this small, soft creature had evolved under forces that would crush most species into the ground before they ever learned to stand." "Your world has tectonic plates," Dean said, reading from the data she had gathered from the capsule's memory core. "Active volcanism and a rotational axial tilt of 23 degrees, which means your seasons shift drastically and your climate is unstable across the entire surface. We also have hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes," Mara added helpfully. "And about 70% of the surface is covered in water that we cannot breathe in." "And yet you evolved there," Dean said. "We did more than evolve there," Mara said, and there was a quiet pride in her voice. "We dominated it." She told them about predators, about creatures with claws and fangs and venom and crushing strength that shared the planet with humans for millions of years, and how humans had survived not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the most stubborn. "We are persistence predators," she explained to a room full of aliens who had gone very quiet. We cannot outrun most animals on our world, but we do not need to. We just follow them. We walk, and we jog, and we track them across distances that no other predator can sustain, and we do not stop. We keep going until the prey collapses from exhaustion, and then we are there. Torek, who was built like a wall of muscle and scale, and who had won combat tournaments on 3 different worlds, looked at Mara with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and she realized after a moment that it was unease. "You chase your prey until it dies of fear and exhaustion," he said. "Yes," Mara said simply. Din had begun compiling what she called the human file, and every day it grew longer. Every day she looked more alarmed. Humans consumed ethanol recreationally, a substance that was a cleaning solvent on most civilized worlds. They drank it at celebrations and social gatherings, and sometimes just because they felt like it, and their livers had evolved specifically to process it, so they would not die, although Mara admitted that sometimes they still did. Humans exposed themselves to ultraviolet radiation deliberately for cosmetic reasons. They called it tanning. Humans had reached space not through elegant gravitational manipulation or field distortion, but by strapping themselves to canisters of controlled explosions and riding the fire upward through the atmosphere. And when Mara described this process casually over dinner, Dian set down her food and did not pick it up again. "You sit on top of an explosion," Dian said. "A controlled explosion," Mara corrected. "That is still an explosion." "Yes, but we aim it downward." New section to the human file that she titled simply, "Why?" But the thing that shook the crew most deeply was not the death world, or the predator heritage, or the explosive space travel. It was a single number. When the Meridian launched, Mara told them humanity had only been a spacefaring species for 87 years. They had gone from their first powered flight to deep space exploration in less than a century, which was a pace of advancement so fast that Dean had to check her translation software 3 times because she was convinced the number was wrong. Most species in the Galactic Index took between 2,000 and 5,000 years to go from atmospheric flight to interstellar travel. The Velhari had taken 3,000, the Krethians had taken 4,000, and the fastest species on record had done it in 800 years, and they were considered an extraordinary outlier. 87 years was not fast. It was impossible. It was the kind of number that made scientists question their models and their assumptions and their understanding of what intelligence was capable of. "You are an impossible species," Dian said to Mara one evening as they sat together in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars. "You have no right to exist, and yet here you are." Mara smiled at that, but the smile did not reach her eyes, because behind the conversations and the data sharing and the slow building of trust with this alien crew, she was carrying a weight that none of them could fully understand. Everyone she had ever known was dead. Not just dead, but gone for so long that even the memory of them had probably turned to dust. Her parents and her sister and the crew of the Meridian and her friends and her neighbors and every single human being who had been alive when she closed her eyes 12,000 years ago. She did not know if humanity had survived. For all she knew, she was the last one, and the species that Dian found so fascinating was already extinct, and she was nothing but a relic, a fossil that had somehow kept breathing long after everything it belonged to had ended. She did not say any of this out loud, but Ilindra saw it. Ilindra watched Mara laugh with the crew and study their technology and ask questions about the galaxy with a sharp, curious mind that never seemed to rest. And she watched the way Mara's face changed when she thought no one was looking, the way the light went out of her eyes for just a moment before she pulled it back and kept going. One night, Ilindra found Mara alone in the cargo bay, sitting next to the empty capsule that had carried her across 12,000 years of silence. And Mara was not crying, but she was holding something small in her hand, a data chip, she had pulled from the capsule's memory core. "What is that?" Ilindra asked softly. "A star chart," Mara said. "It was in the pod's emergency files. It shows the location of my home world." She held it up, and on the tiny screen was a map with a single point of light, marked with a word in Mara's language, that the translator rendered simply as home. Ilindra looked at the map, and then she looked at Mara, and she understood what was being asked, without it being spoken. "We could go there," Ilindra said. Mara looked up at her, and in her eyes was something that Ilindra recognized, because she had seen it before in the faces of lost travelers, and stranded pilots, and people who had been far from home for far too long. It was hope, and it was the most human thing Ilindra had ever seen, even though she had not yet learned to call it that. "Would you?" Mara whispered. The journey to the coordinates on Mara's star chart would take 3 weeks at full faster-than-light speed, and when Ilindra announced the course change to the crew, Torek filed a formal objection, which Ilindra acknowledged and then ignored. "You are diverting a Survey Authority vessel from its assigned route to chase a 12,000-year-old map," Torek said, standing in her office with his arms crossed and his yellow eyes hard. "Yes," Ilindra said. "For one passenger, yes." Torek stared at her for a long moment, and then he uncrossed his arms and sighed through his nostrils in the way that Krethians did when they had lost an argument they knew they were never going to win. "I will adjust the fuel calculations," he said, and left. During the 3 weeks of travel, Mara did something that none of the crew expected. She integrated. She learned the Velhari language not through the translator, but by listening and repeating and asking Dian to correct her pronunciation, and within 10 days she was speaking it well enough to hold basic conversations without technological assistance. Dian, who had studied xenolinguistics for 30 years, said she had never seen anyone acquire a new language that fast. She studied the ship's systems with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, asking the engineering team to explain every component and every mechanism, and then asking follow-up questions that revealed she had not just memorized what they told her, but had actually understood it deeply enough to identify improvements. She trained in the cargo bay every morning, doing exercises that involved lifting her own body weight in repetitive motions, and running in place for 30 minutes at a time. And when Torek watched her do this, he asked what she was training for, and she said, "Nothing specific. Humans just stop working properly if we do not move enough," which Torek found deeply concerning. About Mara happened on the 14th day. A coolant line in the lower engineering deck ruptured without warning, and the compartment filled with thoraxin gas. This gas was mildly irritating to Velhari skin, but lethal to Krethians within 60 seconds. Torek was in that compartment when it happened. The alarm shrieked across the ship, and Ilindra shouted for an emergency seal, but the manual override was inside the compartment, and Torek was already on his knees, choking. His scales were turning gray, and no one could get to him, because the gas would kill any Krethian who entered, and would incapacitate a Velhari in minutes. Mara was running before anyone told her what was happening. She had heard the alarm and smelled the gas from 2 corridors away, because human olfactory senses, while not the sharpest in the galaxy, were specifically attuned to detecting chemical threats. She knew from her study of the ship's systems exactly what had failed, and exactly where the problem was. Manual seal was. She took a deep breath and held it, and ran into the gas-filled compartment. And she found Torek on the floor, and she grabbed him under the arms and dragged him toward the door. And he was twice her weight. But she did not stop. She planted her feet and pulled with everything she had, and her muscles screamed, and her vision blurred, because thoraxin gas was not lethal to humans, but it was far from harmless, and it burned her eyes and her throat and her lungs. She got Torek through the door, and then she turned back and ran to the manual override panel, and slammed her fist into it, and the compartment sealed, and the ventilation system engaged, and she stood there for one moment, breathing the last of the contaminated air, before she walked back into the corridor and collapsed. She was coughing blood for 6 hours, and Dean kept her in the medical bay under observation, convinced that her lungs had been permanently damaged. Mara was back on her feet in 2 days. Torek came to see her in the medical bay on the first day, and he stood in the doorway for a long time, saying nothing, and Mara looked up at him from her bed, with red-rimmed eyes and a bandage across her nose, and she said, "You would have done the same for me." "I am not certain I would have," Torek said honestly. "Then next time you will," Mara said, and she smiled, and Torek realized that this small, fragile, impossible creature had just risked her life for his, without a single moment of hesitation, and he understood then what Elindra had understood from the beginning, which was that fragility and weakness were not the same thing. He never questioned her presence on the ship again. 5 days later, they encountered the Dreth Hegemony. The Hegemony patrol vessel was 3 times the size of the Wandering Petal, and it dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in their path, with its weapons already charged, and its commander's face already on their communication screen before Elindra had time to react. The commander was Drethari, a species that looked like someone had built a spider out of iron and given it a bad temper, and he spoke with the flat authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Velhari vessel, you are transiting hegemony-controlled space. Submit to inspection." Elindra kept her voice calm. "We are a survey authority vessel on a scientific mission. We have no cargo of interest." "Our scans indicate an unregistered biological on your ship," the commander said, and his multiple eyes narrowed. "Species unknown. You will surrender the specimen for cataloging and processing immediately." Elindra felt her skin flash cold, because she knew what hegemony cataloging meant. It meant a lab and a cage, and a series of tests that the subject did not survive. "The individual aboard our ship is a sentient being under the protection of Velhari survey law," Elindra said firmly. "Specimen." "You are not in Velhari space, Captain," the commander replied. "Surrender the biological, or we will board your vessel and take it." The bridge was silent and tense, and Elindra was calculating options that all ended badly when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Mara walking onto the bridge. Mara had been listening from the corridor, and she had spent the last 4 days not just learning the Velhari language, but also studying every other language in the ship's database, and the Drethari language was harsh and clicking and difficult. But Mara had learned enough of it in 4 days to do what she did next. She stepped in front of the communication screen and looked directly at the Hegemony commander, and she spoke to him in his own language. "I am Commander Mara Ewan," she said, and her pronunciation was imperfect, but her voice was iron. "I am a representative of a species you have never encountered from a world you cannot find. And I am not cargo, and I am not afraid of you." The commander's eyes widened, because no unregistered species had ever spoken Drethari to a hegemony officer before. "If you board this vessel," Mara continued, "I will consider it an act of war against my people, and you should know that my people have a very long memory for people who start wars with us. Even if I am the only one left, I promise you, that is enough." The commander stared at her, and Mara stared back, and the silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. The hegemony vessel powered down its weapons and pulled away, and the commander cut the communication without another word. Torek let out a breath he had been holding for 2 minutes, and Dean added a new entry to the human file that simply read, "They bluff like they mean it." But Elindra looked at Mara, and she knew it had not been a bluff. 3 days later, they reached the Sol system. Mara stood at the viewport as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the stars resolved into a familiar pattern that she had not seen in 12,000 years, and her hands gripped the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The system was quiet. No transmissions, no energy signatures, No stations, no ships. Nothing but silence and the cold light of a yellow star that Mara called sun. Torek said nothing, and Dean said nothing, and Elindra said nothing, because they all understood what this silence might mean. Then Dean's console erupted. Not with one signal, but with thousands, layered and encrypted and blazing across every frequency the ship could detect. And the scanner displays overloaded and reset and overloaded again, because the amount of data pouring in was beyond anything the wandering petal was designed to process. "The system is not empty," Dean gasped. "It is shielded. There is a cloaking network surrounding the entire system, and it is the most advanced technology I have ever seen." A voice cut through the static then, calm and warm and speaking Mara's language with perfect clarity. "Unidentified vessel, you are entering protected space. Identify yourselves." Mara's hands were trembling as she reached for the communication panel, and her voice broke on the first word, but she kept going. "This is Commander Mara UN, ESS Meridian, service number 7712. I am coming home." There was a long pause. And then the voice on the other end said something that made Mara's knees buckle. "Stand by, Commander. We have been waiting for you." The cloak parted like a curtain being drawn back from a window, and what lay behind it broke every assumption the crew of the Wandering Petal had ever held about what a civilization could become. Earth was there, blue and green and wrapped in white clouds, exactly as the old images in Mara's capsule had shown it. But it was not alone. It was the center of something vast and alive and breathtaking in its scale. Mars glowed with the amber and green of a world that had been made habitable by hands that refused to accept a planet as it was, and decided to make it into what it could be. And its atmosphere shimmered with the telltale signs of active weather systems that nature had not put there. The asteroid belt was gone, or rather it had been reorganized, reshaped into a ring of interconnected habitats and stations that stretched in a glittering arc across millions of kilometers, and each structure was different from the last. As if the builders had decided that uniformity was boring and variety was a better use of infinite resources. Jupiter's moons glowed with city lights, and Saturn's rings had been threaded with structures so delicate and enormous at the same time, that Dian could not tell where engineering ended and art began. There were ships everywhere, not military vessels bristling with weapons, but graceful things that moved through the system like living creatures. And the energy output of even the smallest one registered on the Wandering Petal sensors as greater than the entire Velhari survey fleet combined. "This is impossible," Dian whispered, and her skin was flickering through colors so fast that Elindra knew she had lost all emotional control. "This is 12,000 years of development, Captain. They did not stop. They never stopped." An escort vessel approached them, and it was small by the standards of what surrounded it, but it radiated a calm, confident power that made the Wandering Petal feel like a candle next to a star. And when it opened a communication channel, the face that appeared on the screen was unmistakably human, but different. The woman who greeted them was tall, nearly 2 meters, with dark skin and silver eyes that seemed to process light in ways that normal eyes did not, and she moved with a fluid grace that suggested her body had been refined over millennia of deliberate, careful evolution, not away from humanity, but deeper into it. "Commander Ewan," the woman said, and her smile was warm and real and full of an emotion that Elindra could feel, even across the communication link. "My name is Adayeze. I am your welcome escort. On behalf of the Soul Collective, I want to tell you that today is a very good day." "How?" Mara said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "How did you know to wait for me?" "We found the Meridian 600 years after it was lost," Adayeze said. "We recovered every crew member's remains and gave them honors and memorials that still stand today. But your emergency pod had launched before the explosion, and we never found you. Your transponder signal was degraded beyond our scanning range at the time." At the time, Mara repeated. Our range improved, Adazi said simply. We have been scanning for your signal for over 11,000 years, Commander. We never stopped looking. Mara put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes, and Alindra saw her shoulders shake once and then go still, and then Mara opened her eyes and they were wet, but her voice was steady. Permission to come home, she said. Granted, Adazi said, with all our hearts granted. The escort vessel guided the wandering petal through the system, and Alindra stood at the viewport and watched a civilization pass by that made her feel very small and very young. And she had been exploring the stars for 100 years, but she had never seen anything like this. These humans had not abandoned what they were. They had not uploaded themselves into machines, or transcended into energy beings, or any of the other paths that ancient civilizations sometimes took. They had remained flesh and blood and bone and heart, and they had simply made themselves better, stronger, longer-lived, adapted for the void of space, but still recognizably the same species that had once chased its prey across the grasslands of a death world, until the prey could not run anymore. They landed on Earth on a field of green grass near a coastline where the ocean met the shore in a line of white foam, and the air smelled like salt and growing things, and Mara stepped off the ship, and her bare feet touched the ground, and she stood there for a long time, with her eyes closed, and her face turned up toward the sun. Then she knelt down and pressed her palms flat against the earth, and she wept, not with grief, but with something bigger than grief, something that had no name in any language Alindra knew, the sound of someone who had been lost for 12,000 years, finally feeling the ground beneath her, and knowing that it was real, and that she was home. Alindra gave her time. Later that day, Alindra was invited to a gathering, and she expected a formal ceremony with officials and speeches, and the rigid protocol that most advanced civilizations use to mark important occasions. Instead, she found a field. Thousands of humans had gathered under the open sky as the sun went down, and the stars came out one by one. And they were not standing in formation or wearing uniforms. They were sitting on the grass and standing in clusters, and holding each other and laughing. And someone had brought food, and someone else had brought instruments that made music. And children were running between the adults, playing games that involved a lot of falling down and getting back up. And then they began to sing. It was not a war chant, or a hymn of conquest, or an anthem of power. It was something softer and older, important, a melody that rose from thousands of voices at once. And it said without words what words could never fully say, which was, "Welcome home. We missed you. You were never forgotten." Alindra stood at the edge of the field and listened, and her skin glowed a deep, steady blue that her species associated with the deepest form of emotional resonance, and she felt tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away. Torek stood beside her, and he was silent for a long time before he spoke. "I have been to war," he said quietly. "I have seen species that could crack moons and burn worlds and reshape the fabric of space itself. But I have never seen anything as powerful as this." "As what?" Alindra asked. "As a species that waited 11,000 years for one person to come home," he said. "Not because she was important strategically, or because she carried valuable information, or because they needed her for anything at all, but because she was one of them, and they do not leave their people behind." Dian found Mara later that evening, sitting on a low hill overlooking the field, where the singing had given way to conversation and laughter, and the quiet, happy noise of people being together. "What do you think of what your species became?" Dian asked. Mara looked out at the green earth and the lights of the celebration, and the stars above that her people had claimed, not through conquest, but through patience and will, and the stubborn refusal to ever stop reaching. And she smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes. "They are exactly what I hoped we would be," she said. Ilindra filed her report to the Velhari Survey Authority the next morning, and it was the shortest report she had ever written in her 140 years of service. It read, Species, Human, Origin, Earth, Class 12 Death World, Status, Active, Thriving beyond all projections. Disposition, they remember their own. Threat assessment, only if you give them a reason. Recommendation, be kind to them, they have earned it. She paused before submitting it and added one final line. Personal note, in 140 years of mapping the empty places between the stars, I never once found something that made me believe the universe had a purpose. I am no longer certain that is true. She sent the report and walked back out onto the green grass of Earth, where Mara was teaching Torik how to throw a ball, and Dian was trying human food for the first time and making faces that suggested she was not sure if she loved it or hated it. And the sun was warm, and the wind smelled like the ocean, and somewhere in the distance, someone was laughing. Ilindra sat down on the grass beside her crew, and she looked up at the sky, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not see the emptiness between the stars. She saw the light.